Hi, nice to see you all. Crikey me, these things are well attended. No pressure, David. I'm Simon from Till Hill, and this is David from Carbon Store. We're here today to provide an overview and hopefully a little bit of interesting detail on a couple of hot topics. Grant funding for woodland creation in England and other tree-related options, plus associated potential for carbon revenue. A little bit about Till Hill, a company with quite a lengthy history now. We've been trading for about 75 years. Interestingly started life as a forest nursery business back in the dim and distant, and fairly recently went back into the nursery trade in 2019 with the acquisition of Mailer Forest Nurseries, where we produce some 35 million or so small trees every year to try and supply the sector, not just ourselves. We are the largest forestry company in the UK, so as you can see the locations on the map there represents area offices. We have about 240 employees, and you could be forgiven for thinking we're very corporate, but I'd like to make the point, certainly in my time with the company today, we are all very much human, friendly and approachable. Most importantly, we don't just do big and commercial stuff. We are all passionate about trees and about what we do. Some of our service offerings detailed there for you. I suppose our mission statement is to try and be a fairly comprehensive one-stop shop for all things to do with trees and woodlands, management services, advice and related environmental services also. And we are, for that reason, used to working and collaborating with a variety of other businesses and stakeholders, like land agents and so on, all over the country. And we offer a range of complementary services in those circumstances. Quick bit on me, as my kids are keen to point out, I've been around the block, so to speak, both public and private sector experience. In a former life, working predominantly on golf courses of all places, advising on tree and woodland management, followed by several years working on the public forest estate up in Yorkshire on forest management, including a secondment to Slowing the Flow at Pickering project, one of the very first natural flood management demonstration projects funded by DEFRA, and that topic remains a subject close to my heart. Then more recently, over 10 years now with Till Hill, fulfilling a variety of roles over time. And I now cover the whole of England, so I spend a lot of time in the car, as you can imagine. And if you had to make an inquiry with Till Hill and you live anywhere in England, you'd probably be referred to me in the first instance or one of my team. I should say, therefore, that there are a range of grants available for managing existing woodlands, including management planning, managing the impacts of tree pests and disease like ash dieback and cholera, Phytophthora in larch. Come and see us afterwards if you'd like to discuss any of the management planning grants and so on for existing woodland, but today the focus is very much on woodland creation options. And hopefully we're becoming increasingly aware of the benefits that trees and woodlands on a given property can provide, some of them highlighted there. As I say, we are nationwide, operating on a variety of different property types and different client types. And with the timber sector being increasingly buoyant over recent years, particularly towards the end of the pandemic, we're finding landowners are definitely becoming a lot more progressive, looking at more integrated management systems and the like, and their awareness and expectations of their woodlands, trees and hedgerows and the benefits they can provide, in addition to traditional outputs like timber income from harvesting activity. And to my mind, land management and land use isn't really rocket science. Trends and incentives come and go over time, but essentially all we tend to be looking for is the right end use for the right field parcel at the end of the day. Woodland doesn't have to form the whole solution. It might only ever be a small part of the framework around the principal farming activity, or a small step in the direction of farm business diversification, sustainability, or carbon balancing. To help us achieve the sort of aspirations of government and create woodland at the scale required to meet domestic and international sustainability targets, let's be fair, we've probably got a very favourable wind. Certainly in my career to date, I think we're seeing the best financial offers for new planting in England that I've ever seen. So between policy, capital funding and additional revenue streams coming now becoming available, as I say, a positive environment. So capital grant support for woodland creation. This used to be really simple. Back in the day, we used to have one prevailing funding mechanism at any one time. The arrival of UCO a couple of years back, yet another new woodland creation grant is starting to make me feel my age. I'm sad to say I've been around since the days of the England Woodland Grant Scheme, Woodland Grant Schemes 1, 2 and 3, the Farm Woodland Scheme, the Farm Woodland Premium Scheme, long before more recent offerings like the Woodland Carbon Fund, Countryside Stewardship, Woodland Creation and the HS2 Woodland Fund. Thankfully, I'm far too young to have had any professional involvement with approved woodland planting under dedication. But we did learn about that at the National Forestry School back in the mid-90s, just in case. And it's interesting to note, under the Farm Woodland Scheme, for landowners prepared to plant 90% oak or beech, or a combination of the two, were eligible for annual payments after planting for a whopping 40 years. Glory days indeed, long gone, I'm afraid, but I digress. Anyway, you can see from the current list there that capital planting grants are becoming increasingly complex and complex to navigate. So in a bit more detail, starting from the outset with exploring the potential for woodland creation. If you're feeling brave and considering anything at scale, and by that I mean anything from 5 hectares upwards, there's the option to assess the basic plantability of land using grant funding. Woodland Creation Planning Grant allows you or an agent like Till Hill on your behalf to undertake scoping work, checking, making stakeholder engagement, background and constraints checking, identifying specific interests or priority habitats that might preclude planting, or any existing obligations on land to determine whether or how much of the land is essentially plantable with trees. Creation Planning Grant is paid in 2 instalments, £1,000 standard stage 1 payment for what used to be desktop exercise, information gathering exercise. And then if the project looks like it's got legs after stage 1, you'll be invited to proceed to stage 2, which on completion effectively provides the landowner with a UKFS compliant tree planting plan. You might have noticed I'm a little bit sceptical about Creation Planning Grant, mainly because it has become such a monstrous task. It's in its 2nd iteration, and the amount of information required to populate the relevant forms and paperwork and the journey you go on and the timescale associated with that is quite considerable. It was a grant that was intended to facilitate getting trees in the ground, and I'm not sure it always quite achieves that for a number of reasons I won't go into detail about now. So, if your woodland creation aspirations are quite straightforward or not at great scale, it's often worth considering going straight to a capital grant application. Starting with UCO, the new scheme launched in June 21 and represents a significant increase in the cash on the table to incentivise tree planting in England. The scheme allows you to plant native broadleaves, conifer species, or a mix of the two. And we do advise planting a resilient mix these days, mainly because of the multiple risks from pest and disease that we're seeing very much on the increase. Minimum scheme size is 1 hectare, roughly 2.5 acres, and this can comprise of multiple smaller component parts, individual compartment sizes small as 0.1 of a hectare. We've also recently seen the average cap per hectare increased from £8,500 per hectare for capital items up to £10,200 per hectare in January this year. And the intention for that is to try and offer 100% capital funding or coverage of capital planting costs at year one. Based on real world costs, however, I would just manage your expectations on that and tell you it doesn't quite achieve it. But that's not the only component part or element to the new grant offer. In addition to the usual tariff of capital items, UCO, unlike any previous scheme, provides an additional incentive through additional contributions designed to reward landowners for the public benefits that their scheme will generate, based on a range of spatial targeting data sets. Before you all leave, this doesn't necessarily mean swinging the gate open to allow the access for the great British public, although this is an option. These supplements you can see are stackable, so more than one may or usually does apply. And in theory, you could garner an additional £8,000 per hectare through supplements. But I would say that's quite unlikely. I've yet to find the perfect field parcel that ticks every box known to man. But we are seeing people normally click for 1 or 2 or 3, and the average grant yield tends to be in the region of 11 to about £13,000 per hectare in normal circumstances. After planting, you're eligible for 10 annual maintenance payments at £350 per year. And if you're claiming basic payment on the land prior to planting, in normal circumstances, you're eligible to continue to claim that as it winds down or evaporates quickly. So just to give you a quick flavour of the spatial targeting I mentioned, I've screen snipped a few here. That first one you can see is nature recovery, about extending, linking and expanding existing woodland habitat. The murky brown buffer around the existing woodland cover you can see is high priority zone. So a supplement there applicable to the whole connected new woodland area is £2,800 as long as you touch it. And the grey area, pretty much the rest of England, with the exception of peri-urban areas, is still subject to a supplement of £1,100 per hectare in the lower priority zone. Water quality, self-explanatory, green areas, priority river catchments and the like, rewards you with £400 a hectare. Flood risk alleviation, higher or lower priority, in red or beige there you can see, and you receive an additional £500 per hectare. And riparian buffers, this is basically about protecting and buffering riparian zones, individual stream channels, rivers and naturalised drainage systems. That's quite a chunky supplement at £1,600 per hectare, but it's only applicable if you're planting within 10 metres of the channel, and it pays for the land area up to 50 metres from the channel, so very much those blue corridors you can see on the map. And then, horror of horrors, I mentioned public access. Under proximity to settlements, if you're within striking distance of a certain population and within the pink zones on the map, you automatically receive a supplement of £500 a hectare for the perceived public benefits your new woodland will provide that population with. So typically landscape and biodiversity gains. And then if you go completely bonkers and you're prepared to throw open the gates and facilitate permissive pedestrian recreational access for a term of 30 years, you can receive an additional £2,200 per hectare. And there is another layer there relating to air quality and ammonia emissions around designated features and specific interests. This one doesn't pay anything, but if you're in the turquoise zone there, it's basically a big tick in the box for tree planting in those areas. Moving on, another funding option, if you happen to own or be acquiring land in any of the 13 community forest areas in England, which now occupy quite a large part of the country, as you can see, with 2 more to come later this year. You can access the same Nature for Climate funding that pays for UCO through an alternative route directly with the community forest teams. They all seem to be doing their own thing a little bit and administering the funding slightly differently. But in these areas, the TFC offer can usually be expected to equal or better UCO, with the potential for maintenance payments over a longer term of up to 15 years. In our experience to date, the grant funding mechanism that suits you best may well depend on the effectively the capital costs versus your maintenance costs and the proportion of each, because there's phased payments which apply to the TFC offer, typically 70% on completion of planting, 20% between years 3 and 5 on satisfactory establishment, and then a retention of 10%, which is released at the end of the maintenance term. Other funding options, strangely enough, HS2 Woodland Fund has just reopened with the final planting season of winter 24-25 for native woodland schemes of between 5 hectares and 25 hectares and within 25 miles of the HS2 Phase 1 route. On the positive side, the first round of HS2 was quite straightforward. The application process was quite easy, and maintenance was paid in 2 lump sums at the ends of years 5 and 10 respectively. Time will tell whether we see any more HS2 woodland funds associated with additional elements of the track network, if they ever happen. But essentially the offer for HS2 Woodland Fund Mark II is one and the same as UCO, but the HS2 company pay the capital rate, item rates. And if you really don't want to work with the HS2 company, you can opt out, and even if you're in the target zone, and just go for UCO instead. Just to point out, there's also, we're seeing an increase of completely different funding models for new woodlands. We're seeing a lot of private investment funds now being directed towards green schemes, some driven purely by carbon unit acquisition, others with more of an interest in the wider metrics around woodland creation, the wider benefits like natural capital. But it's an option available. We are also seeing a significant increase, carbon units and other metrics aside, we're seeing a lot of simple sponsorship offers coming through now, with businesses just wanting to be linked to schemes with genuine green credentials. And these opportunities can often be quite low in terms of obligation from the landowner and legacy that after planting. With all that in mind, I really do think it's a time of opportunity for landowners, largely irrespective of the property type and the scale of planting and trees. And I'd like to think us foresters can actually provide balanced advice. It's not just about trying to shoehorn woodland onto a given property for the sake of it, or to try and meet grant criteria. I think there's a lot of other options that may be more sustainable or more equitable when compared with woodland creation per se, and they may be more favourable in terms of ongoing cropping or livestock regimes. Agroforestry in particular seems to be gathering ahead of steam, with the capital grant scheme launching next year, and the promise of better blended funding options going forwards, which should allow better integration of trees and farming, whether through infield systems like wood pasture, shelter belts or other. I think farmers and foresters can really seek to collaborate on new and innovative farming and nature-based solutions. And most importantly, we have to try and promote the message, the inclusion of trees and tree systems. It shouldn't be perceived as stopping farming or as an alternative to farming. I'd normally just cover the basics on woodland carbon at this point, but I don't normally have David sat next to me, so I'll defer to him on this occasion. And very briefly, instead, I'd just like to illustrate the point that woodland creation at scale isn't just something happening up in the frozen north of England now. We're seeing large schemes progressing in the home counties. So a very quick case study directly relevant to this part of the country, summarised there for you. Till Hill and Carbon Store worked closely with the landowner on the project from initial discussions through concept plans to delivery, producing the woodland creation plan, applying for UCO grant funding, and then implementing the scheme on the ground. The landowners' objectives were really to diversify by increasing woodland cover on the farm, family-owned farm, to create a more resilient business model, and also provide a space for the local community for permissive access with the provision of mental and health and physical benefits associated with the informal woodland recreation. This wasn't actually, in this case, funded through grant contribution. In turn, NatWest Group are supporting the creation of the new woodlands by purchasing the carbon credits associated with the project. They want to deliver a more sustainable economy and future for their customers and communities by helping in their own way to address climate change, which is now a strategic priority for the bank. So the bank's supporting a farm business to diversify, sequester carbon in order to mitigate climate change and provide a space intended for informal permissive access to that local community. A win-win. And NatWest and the landowner engaged Carbon Store to facilitate the sale of the carbon units. Tree planting and biodiversity outputs effectively 46,000 trees and shrubs planted across 3 compartments on the farm. Till Hill and the landowner identified a diverse mix that met his objectives, predominantly native broadleaves, pedunculate oak and hornbeam and the like for longevity and sustainable habitat provision, plus a range of other native trees and shrubs, as I say. And I think what I'm trying to convey with this project and some of the photographs you can see there is that there's often a perception about carbon offsetting and green sponsorship, and that it's all quite cynical or faceless and just a corporate exercise in paying your dues and carrying on damaging the environment. But when I at least see schemes like this going in the ground with landowners actually meeting the carbon buyers and starting to deliver a range of tangible benefits on farm, it feels like a very different, entirely positive and environmental endeavour. Just a quick one, I did mention this briefly. UK's first agroforestry show is happening, a 2-day event in September. We'll be there speaking and supporting as co-sponsors. If you want to attend, there's probably some leaflets on your seats. There's a Groundswell offer, courtesy of Helen at the Woodland Trust, so please come and see us if you want to access that and you haven't got a flyer. I hope that's been useful and informative. Quite a lot of technical stuff to whistle through in 20 minutes or so, so please don't hesitate to ask questions after David's spoken, or alternatively come and see us at the stand. David.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you everyone for coming along and listening to us this morning. So Simon spent the last 20 minutes just talking through the government subsidies that are available to support woodland creation. And I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes looking at an equally and increasingly valuable source of additional income to woodlands, which is from carbon funding. And the basic principles, Simon's touched on them briefly in his example he's just given, but the basic principles are best illustrated by a case study of a recent example, whereby back in 2018 we were approached by a Welsh sheep farmer who had read the winds of change, had recognised that his subsidies were declining, and he was looking to diversify his income. And so Till Hill helped him design the woodland. we put the trees in the ground for him, and then Carbon Store worked through the protocols and the processes associated with the Woodland Carbon Code, and I'll go into those in a moment. But eventually, in late 2020, he was issued with approximately 7,000 carbon credits from his woodland. And around that time, I was also approached by the managing director of a company called Selco Builders Warehouse, which operates builders merchants across the Midlands and the Southeast. And Howard Luft had calculated, or his team had calculated, that the emissions from his fleet of trucks that were delivering breeze blocks and bricks and timber beams to his builders' customers across from the depots was emitting approximately 4,000 tons of carbon per year. So I put him in touch with Jack. We agreed a fair price for the 4,000 PIUs that Jack was looking to sell, and we got a very positive outcome. Jack managed to get a significant sum of liquidity to support investment in his farm, and Howard and the team at Selco Builders Warehouse knew that they were directly responsible for the planting of an ecologically rich, productive woodland that is going to create jobs and economic activity in the local area. So as you can see, the basic principles of carbon funding have a very positive impact when they're done right. However, Howard would not have undertaken that transaction if he could not trust the implicit claims within the carbon credits, namely that they truly represent the capture of 1 ton of carbon. And in order to build up this trust, the UK government back in 2011 established the Woodland Carbon Code, which is the carbon standard for woodland creation in the UK. And as you can see by the logos on the slide, it does have strong credentials. It's backed by ICROA, which is an international carbon standards body. It's operated and run by Scottish Forestry. Forest Research has developed the science underpinning its calculations. And so as I talk you through the rules and protocols shortly, you will roll your eyes when you see the bureaucracy that is associated with the Woodland Carbon Code. But please understand, it serves a very important purpose, because without that implicit trust in the carbon credit, you wouldn't have the value that underpins them. So this is a good point to introduce Carbon Store and explain who we are. We are the Woodland Carbon Division of Till Hill Forestry. We were set up back in 2019, in late 2019, to help Till Hill's clients, and I should say all forms of landowners, from farmers, local councils, the more traditional landed estates, to capitalise on this growing market for woodland carbon. And in line with that, we provide 3 basic services. We help forestry managers, farmers, to design a woodland that maximises your income from grant funding, that maximises your available timber income, and also ensures that you get carbon funding along the way. We also undertake the lengthy and bureaucratic paperwork that's associated with the Woodland Carbon Code. And then finally, we help woodland owners to sell their carbon credits. So to start by explaining the basics of the approval process under the Woodland Carbon Code. And there are 3 basic steps. And it starts with registration, which serves 2 purposes. Firstly, it just registers your intent with the Woodland Carbon Code to plant up a specific area of land on your farm. Secondly, it opens an account with the UK Land and Carbon Registry, which is sort of akin to opening a bank account, and it's into that account where the carbon credits will be deposited. Secondly, the second step is validation. This takes place shortly after planting, and it culminates with the issuance of PIUs into your account on that UK Land Carbon Registry, and I'll explain PIUs in a moment. And then finally, the woodland undergoes a series of verifications over the period of its existence, or lifetime under the Woodland Carbon Code, I should say. And again, each verification culminates with the issuance or the conversion of PIUs into WCUs. So what are these PIUs and these WCUs? A PIU stands for a pending issuance unit, and it represents a promise to capture 1 ton of carbon. They are issued very soon after planting is finished, and they are a precursor to a woodland carbon unit. They're legally recognised, they're saleable, and as I say, they're a precursor to a WCU. The WCU actually represents 1 ton of captured carbon. And I hope the slide on the next page illustrates the relationship between the two. So as you can see with the orange line, which represents the PIUs associated with a project, you start in year 0, just after planting, you've got 100% of the carbon credits are PIUs and 0% are WCUs. And then slowly, by the end of the lifetime of the woodland, 100% are WCUs, and there are 0 PIUs attached to the woodland. So just to move on and talk you through this registration process in a little bit more detail. And the as I mentioned, it registers your intent to plant a specific area of land. But a key point to notice is that you need to be registering your woodland before any ground preparation starts. So if you're already using Till Hill, then you're in safe hands, and they'll make sure you're in touch with Carbon Store. If, God forbid, you're not using Till Hill, then please, we can still undertake this work. And I say that in jest, but actually there's a serious point underlying it, because it's important that you're using an experienced operator in this field, because there are a lot of intricacies to the Woodland Carbon Code. Anyway, you've then opened your account with the UK Land Carbon Registry, and then you need to fill out the carbon calculator. So this is a formulaic spreadsheet. It details the area that you're planning to plant. It details the ground prep type, the management regime, if you're planning to fell any of the trees, the years in which you're doing so. And that then gives you a rough idea of the amount of carbon you're going to capture over the lifetime of the woodland and when it's going to be captured. So that gives you your PIUs and your WCU volumes, essentially. And then you need a map of the woodland. And again, the Woodland Carbon Code is quite specific in terms of the maps that it requires. The other point is the additionality test. And this requires a little bit more of an explanation. So one thing to keep in mind with the Woodland Carbon Code is that while not all woodlands, how do I put it? So we know that all woodlands capture carbon as the trees grow. However, not all woodlands are carbon offsetting projects. And the Woodland Carbon Code attempts to, the reason the Woodland Carbon Code believes that is that it argues that some woodlands would have been planted anyway. It argues that, as we know, sort of pre-woodland carbon market emerging, we were seeing 8,000, 7,000 hectares of woodland being planted a year. So the Woodland Carbon Code is trying to sort of filter out those woodlands that would have been planted anyway with those that genuinely needed carbon funding in order to go ahead. And it does this by looking at the economics of a project. And it looks at the income that you were earning from the land before it was planted. It looks at the income that you would be earning from the land after planting, excluding carbon funding. And if that income from the planted woodland exceeds the income from the land prior to planting, then the Woodland Carbon Code reasons that the trees would have been planted anyway, and therefore carbon funding is not essential, and that the woodland is not additional. So this is important because it is effectively a major form of the income from a woodland is your timber income. So what the Woodland Carbon Code is effectively doing is placing a cap on the amount of money you can make from that woodland, and it's effectively placing a cap on the productive conifer element that you can plant within a woodland. So as you can see, by the time the trees are in the ground, it's far too late to be going back and adjusting your conifer element in the woodland. So you need to be clear on this before you finalize the design and you start your ground prep. So the step 2, validation. This occurs soon after planting. It's a desk-based audit and makes sure that the woodland complies with the basic rules of the Woodland Carbon Code, that it conforms to UK forestry standards. And there are 3 main documents associated with validation. There's the project design document, which is fairly detailed, 36-page document. There's also the landowner commitment statement, and this is particularly relevant if you are a farmer who's hosting a project, because it outlines the key commitments that you sign up to in operating a woodland under the Woodland Carbon Code. And there are 3 key clauses to watch out for. Firstly, you need to, or you agree to manage that woodland in line with the management plan that you've outlined in the project design document. Secondly, you need to conform with the Woodland Carbon Code's rules and regulations. And thirdly, if you do sell carbon credits from your woodland, you need to inform future woodland owners. If you do sell the woodland, you need to inform any future owners of the carbon contracts that are related to that woodland. So it is a lengthy process, validation. I'll just go through this quickly. The signing of the project design document, the audit by the Soil Association, the approval by the Woodland Carbon Code. It takes about 18 months in total, and there are quite a lot of costs associated with it as well, but I'll come on to those in my final slide. And then step 3 is the verification. You've got, this is akin to, this is the first on-site visit of the woodland, and you have verifications. The first one takes place at year 5, and thereafter verifications must occur at least once every 10 years. And the first verification is akin to a monitoring survey, where you're measuring the height of the trees and you're measuring you're recording the survival rate. And then the verifications at year 15, year 25, and so on are close to mensuration surveys, where you're measuring the volume of standing timber. Based on that, you're calculating the volume of captured carbon, and that then informs the number of PRUs that can be converted into WCUs. So cashing in, at some stage with PRUs and WCUs sitting in your account on the UK Land Carbon Registry, you're going to look to sell your carbon credits. And there's various points to be aware of on this. Firstly, you have total flexibility when you sell your PRUs, or whether you sell them as validated PRUs or verified WCUs. Secondly, you do need to be beware of over-promising and under-delivering. As I mentioned, PRUs are effectively promises to capture a ton of carbon. And so there's a risk that if the woodland is suffers from wind blow or from fire, and you've sold too many PRUs, you're at risk, your trees are at risk of failing to capture the promised volume of carbon, and therefore you may face some liabilities. And that's another point to be aware of, point 4 on the slide, to read those penalty clauses and be aware of what your liabilities could potentially be in a worst case scenario. And then finally, different brokers are adopting different approaches. And I should say that in Carbon Store, we very much emphasize right from the outset the importance of transparency, both in prices and in the commission structure that you're paying for our work in arranging that transaction. So on these final 2 slides, I'm just going to talk you through recent transactions. And there's various data points on here. The most eye-catching of these is that transaction up in Tongue in Sutherland. And this was the first project that underwent its year 15 verification. And I worked closely with the farmer through this, and he was absolutely delighted to be selling his verified WCUs for £65 a piece. Now, I should say there's a scarcity value in these, and so whether that's reflective of the wider trend, but certainly he was able to find a buyer around that price. The other trends evident from the 5 other examples are that, in line with Simon's point on the grant funding, the closer you are to centres of population, the higher the carbon prices are likely to be. And secondly, that broadleaf woodlands generally secure higher prices than their conifer counterparts. And so you can see that, recently selling 2,000, 3,000 PIUs on a conifer productive plantation in Jedburgh versus 7,000 PIUs in Northamptonshire at £30, so almost 50% higher. And then on this final slide, this just goes through the economics of a woodland carbon project. And this is a very standard example. It's a 40-hectare broadleaf woodland. According to the calculator, it's going to be issued with 14,621 PIUs up front, but in actual fact, it'll capture 17,545 tonnes of carbon over its lifetime. And the audit costs that I mentioned earlier, there's our time for undertaking the project design document and that accompanying work. There is the audit costs, I say, from the Soil Association or organic farmers and growers. There are some administrative costs from the UK Land Carbon Registry. And over the next 75 years, those total approximately £41,000. And then in terms of selling the PIUs and WCUs, I've looked at 2 scenarios. In practice, it'll probably be more complex than this, but hopefully these 2 simple extremes give you an idea of the potential income that you could be looking at. You've got, in the first scenario, you're selling 100% of the PIUs up front, and then you will also get some WCUs rebated to you upon each verification. So you're selling the PIUs for £23 a tonne, you're selling the WCUs at £35, and your income on that one would be approximately £400,000. In the second scenario, you're selling the WCUs as they're verified, and on that basis, you would be looking at an income of approximately £573,000. So you get an idea of the broad range of incomes that you would be securing. So with that, thank you for listening, and please do ask any questions.
Thank you, very interesting. A couple of questions. The market for carbon credits is still a bit wild, wild west out there. What are you expecting to see over the next 10, 15 years in terms of the value of those carbon credits? And if you are banking now on the PIUs, do you lose any uplift?
So there's various points in there. And firstly, I think we're all in the market trying to improve the functioning of the market. And I think there's various sort of moves afoot to improve that functioning. I touched on the legal contracts, and we do need standardized terms on that front. In terms of carbon prices, I'm really reluctant to stick a finger in the air and make a prediction on that front, because it really is anyone's guess. And I mean, there's no doubt you are seeing a very broad range of prices. I mean, sort of there are some schemes I know of that have sold for £50 a tonne. Now, actually, if prices suddenly went to a fixed price of £50 a tonne, you would kill the market stone dead at the moment. And we need this evolution in order to provide the incentive to allow the market to develop on the basis of small transactions at the moment, so that it slowly builds up. So I think it's striking a balance with that. I haven't necessarily answered your question, but I hope that helps.
Yeah, thanks for that talk. It was really, really interesting. I was just going to ask a question about sort of where natural regeneration fits into this, and whether sort of like there's a limit in terms of the planting density with these with the woodland carbon code or other like schemes, and if a hybrid of sort of focusing on bramble planting with maybe a standard in the middle and a few shrubs around it, as opposed to sort of a fixed density over the whole area.
Yeah, so in terms of natural colonisation, that's an option within UCO, which I regrettably didn't touch upon. So I kind of described the planted stock scenario. But yes, you can put a proportion of the restocking proposal, planting proposal down to natural colonisation if you feel you can create the right conditions for that colonisation, natural regeneration of desirable tree and shrub species on site. If that helps answer part of your question.
Yeah, hello. Just wondering, under the carbon code, is there any stipulation on what happens to the woodland once it reaches maturity to ensure that any carbon remains locked in?
Yeah. So there is actually a loophole in the woodland carbon code, because you operate for a duration, and you set your duration at the outset, and then once that duration finishes, I mean, sort of, you obviously need to replant if you're going to harvest, but there is a loophole in there, and I know they're aware of it in the woodland carbon code, so I don't think it'll be in there for that much longer.
You also prescribe whether you're going to thin the woodland during the rotation as well. That's kind of prescribed at the point of entry into the carbon code.
Hi, thanks very much for that talk. Really interesting. I just wanted to ask about the concept of stacking and the market implication of stacking things like biodiversity credits and flooding credits, and what you think the implications of that might be on the wider carbon market going forward.
To be honest, I think it's really exciting. And if you can get a situation where you get an effective system of stacking, you use the private market to evaluate the various services being provided by that woodland properly, then actually you end up in a situation where the private market is almost incentivizing the right trees being planted in the right place to carry out the right services. In terms of where we are, I understand that the Woodland Carbon Code is under a certain amount of pressure to facilitate stacking within the confines of the additionality rules, and that's not straightforward. But I think it's important that we develop a market that maintains integrity in the carbon credit, but also facilitates exactly those sorts of the reflection of those sorts of benefits you're talking about in stacking.
Hi, you said that you could sell 100% of the PIUs. I thought you could only sell 80% because 20% had to go into the buffer zone. And do you think the buffer zone concept has a long-term future under the Woodland Carbon Code, or do you think with the revisions it'll get phased out?
Yeah, you're actually only able to sell 64% of the PIUs up front. Once you get into the technicalities, but essentially the PIUs that you're issued with up front only reflects 64% of the actual amount of carbon that the Woodland Carbon Code's calculator expects that area of woodland to capture. So the first 20% haircut goes off to, funnily enough, it's actually it's removed as an insurance policy by the Woodland Carbon Code to take away any risk that you could be over-promising and under-delivering based on faulty calculations within their carbon calculator. So it's effectively an insurance policy. And then the next 20% is actually 20% of that remaining 80%. So that takes you down to 64% of your original carbon credits. To get onto the buffer scheme, this principle of permanence, I don't know how aware you are of this principle of permanence, but it is absolutely crucial that we respect that and that we uphold that. And so I know that they've done a lot of work and a lot of research to make sure that it's at a suitable level that protects that principle of permanence for the long term.
I was going to ask about the mechanisms for tree planting on common land, because this seems very much focused on private land, and what kind of mechanisms exist for collaboration in kind of more complex situations on common land.
So there's potential for that to happen. Planting schemes, afforestation, woodland creation on common land. I would say the management regime is quite difficult, problematic to navigate, and it's a bit like herding ducks to get a common mindset and a general consensus for approval in that sort of scenario. Based on my professional experience to date, we've seen a number of schemes in the embryonic phase look like they have green light from a regulatory approval, and then we've tended to end up in a world of pain with various stakeholders seeking very different things at the end of the day. But it's certainly doable and navigable from a legal perspective, and I think we have to try and look at the greater good and look at all options like public and private land, common land, to get anywhere near our aspirational targets for planting across the countries. So it's a good point, well made. Yeah.
We're increasingly putting woodland creation plans together that have got some sort of social and amenity value to the woodland. Do you see there being a system of social-based credits that will interface with the carbon credits over time? Just curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's really interesting as well. There's so many different new ideas sort of coming through, and that would be a really interesting option as well.
I mean, there's recognition of that within ecosystem service analysis. So yeah, why not? Yeah.
Thanks very much for the talk. It was really, really interesting. I was just wondering if I'd planted some woodland and had, for example, 1,000 PIUs issued, and then I sold that woodland when only 20% of them had been converted into WCUs, would the buyer of that land have a legal obligation to leave the woodland standing, or would there be financial implications for me if I had to pay back the buyer of the PIUs?
So you've got 1,000 PIUs and you've sold those 1,000 PIUs on the woodland. Yeah. So I'm aware of a situation a few years ago where the owner sold PIUs that were generated from a woodland. They didn't inform the subsequent owner, and there was quite a difficult discussion because the penalties were very severe, and eventually an arrangement was agreed. But it's really important that you tell the future owner of those obligations, because otherwise, because you're effectively binding the woodland into being managed in a certain way, and so I suppose you're placing deeds and covenants on that woodland which he's not aware of, basically.
Okay, so even if I had then sold the land, that agreement still stands with the new owner?
Well, only if you've told the new owner.
there's been a lot of talk both about the government schemes and the Woodland Carbon Code in terms of native broadleaves. And then we sort of chuck in conifers. Am I assuming that within these schemes it is all the 3 native conifers, or do we just sort of, we do native broadleaves and then we just chuck in conifers because they're conifers?
So there's a range of conifers available to us. I think the descriptor is whether it's a native species or not. As far as UCO and most of the other grants go, you can plant conifer or non-native component up to 20% within the auspices of UCO. And then it's often, depending on where you are in the country, it's a grey area as to how Scots pine, for instance, is perceived, as whether it's honorary native or not, as the case may be. And that tends to depend much on whether you're in a designated landscape, for instance, a number of other factors. To my mind, we need to be mindful of resilience anyway, whether it's conifer or broadleaf. Probably about 15, 20 years ago, we had a big push within the Forestry Commission managing the public forest estate to broaden the range of conifers that we were using, productive conifers, and based on the potential demise of the usual players in terms of Sitka spruce and the like, suffering more so than other conifer species with climate change predictions in mind. I think we need to be prepared to adapt to that scenario and broaden the range of conifers we use in the UK. And also, at the same time, I'm compelled to consider alternative broadleaf species with an eye on productivity. I was looking at a wonderful trial plot of red alder in North Yorkshire a couple of months ago, and significant potential in terms of commercial timber production from that site visit and trial plot. It looked good to go. I think we need to get less hung up on native species and the like in certain circumstances, and focus more on resilience and resilience to climate change, tree pests and disease.
So within a UCO scheme, we'd be allowed to consider 20% non-natives, and I don't include naturalised, so going further afield, we'd be allowed to consider 20% not truly non-native.
Yeah, and you can actually, what happens if you push the thresholds and you want to plant more conifer well above that threshold, you're perfectly able to do so. You can still claim your capital items, but you forego some of the biodiversity payments like nature recovery above those thresholds, so you lose your additional contributions basically, but you can still plant commercial schemes under UCO grant funding.
Thank you.
Great, thank you for coming along.